There's a kind of power that doesn't come from swords or crowns. It comes from presence, from a queen who dissolved a pearl in vinegar just to win a bet, from Highland women who held entire clans together while the men were off fighting wars, from Renaissance banquets where a single dish could spark an alliance or start a war, and from a wall stretching across mountains and deserts, built on promises of protection and paid for in silence, sweat, and sorrow. Tonight, we're not just talking about history. We're walking through it, not as distant observers, but as witnesses to the lives that shaped empires, defied expectations, and left behind legacies written in eyeliner, firelight, and stone. We'll sail down the Nile on a perfumed barge with Cleopatra, stand guard in a Highland castle with a woman armed with boiling oatmeal, dine in a Medici palace where sugar sculptures tell political secrets, and walk the first Great Wall of China, where a single tear was said to bring down a section of earth. These aren't just stories. They read proof that history isn't made in silence. It is made in whispers and choices, in moments when one person decides to be more than what the world allows. So before you get comfortable, and I hope you do, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. This isn't about numbers. It's about community. And if this resonates with you, I'd love to know. Drop a comment with where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. A late-night thinker in Tokyo, a student in Edinburgh with a cup of tea, someone in Buenos Aires starting their day. You're all part of this story now. Now, let's begin. Segment 1. The Life and Legacy of Cleopatra. Let's begin with a woman who didn't just play the game of power. She rewrote the rules in eyeliner. Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt. Linguist, tactician, mother, survivor, and yes, the most misunderstood woman in history, because what you've seen in the movies. The Elizabeth Taylor version with the gold gown and the dramatic eyeliner wings, that's not the real Cleopatra. That's Rome's revenge. She wasn't just a seductress. She was a sovereign, a ruler who spoke 9 languages, including Egyptian, the first in her Greek dynasty to ever bother, a naval commander, a scientist, a marketer who turned her image into a divine brand. And she did it all in a family so twisted, it made Game of Thrones look like a family picnic. Born into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a line of Macedonian Greeks who ruled Egypt like a personal vacation home, Cleopatra grew up in a world of incest, betrayal, and political theater. Her father, a king so unpopular they called him the flute player, which in ancient terms meant terrible at everything except bad decisions. When he died, Cleopatra didn't inherit the throne. She was forced to marry her 10-year-old brother, Tommy the 13th. Yes, a child. And when she got too ambitious, she was exiled, banished to the desert like a plot twist no one saw coming. But Cleopatra wasn't the type to wait for a rescue, so she did what any self-respecting queen would do. She had herself smuggled into the palace, rolled up in a carpet. Not a metaphor, an actual rug, like a surprise delivery from destiny. And when Julius Caesar unrolled her in his chambers, perfumed, poised, and utterly unafraid, he didn't see a refugee, he saw a partner. Because Cleopatra wasn't just beautiful, she was brilliant. She spoke to Caesar in his language, She knew the politics, the economics, the military strategy, and she offered him something Rome couldn't: stability in Egypt and a loyal ally with a navy and grain supplies. So yes, there was romance. But more than that, there was revolution. She didn't seduce Caesar. She recruited him. And when their son, Caesarion, little Caesar, was born, she didn't hide him. She paraded him as the living heir of Rome and Egypt, minting coins with both their faces, declaring him the son of a god because Caesar was being worshipped. And she styled herself as Isis incarnate. This wasn't ego. It was power projection. She knew that in Egypt, the people followed gods, not politicians. So she became one. And when Caesar fell, stabbed 23 times in the Senate, Cleopatra didn't collapse. She adapted. She found a new Roman, Mark Antony, another general, another man with ambition, and another chance to build a dynasty that could challenge Rome itself. Their meeting, legend. She sailed into Tarsus on a golden barge, purple sails billowing, silver oars beating in rhythm to music, her skin perfumed with mandragoran oil, a scent so intoxicating it allegedly made Roman senators weak in the knees. She wasn't just arriving, she was descending like a goddess from the heavens. And Antony, he wasn't just impressed, he was annihilated. They formed a political alliance. They had children. They declared a new world order with Alexandria, not Rome, at its center. But back in Rome, Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, saw a threat, not just to his power, but to the idea that a woman could outmaneuver Rome. So he launched a propaganda war. He called Cleopatra a sorceress, a foreign temptress, a monster in eyeliner. He said she poisoned men with her gaze, that she ruled through sex, not sense. And when she died, whether by asp, poison, or silent Roman hand, he made sure the story wasn't about her brilliance. It was about her dramatic death. The image of the asp at her breast? That's Roman fiction. A tidy, tragic end for a woman they could never control. But the truth? Cleopatra likely died by poison, one of the many she had tested on prisoners, studying which would kill cleanly, quietly, beautifully. Because even in death she wanted control. And here's the irony. Rome tried to erase her. They destroyed her temples. They silenced her children. They burned her writings, including her lost book on cosmetics, a scientific guide to beauty, medicine, and aphrodisiacs. But in trying to bury her, they made her immortal. Because Cleopatra wasn't just a queen. She was a prototype, the first global influencer, the original beauty CEO, the woman who used language, image, and intelligence as weapons. And 2,000 years later, we're still talking about her. Not because of how she died, but because of how she lived. With every syllable she spoke, every scent she wore, every move she made, she said, "I am not here to please you, I am here to rule." And in the end, that's why they had to mythologize her. Because the truth, that a woman could be smarter, sharper, and stronger than the men around her, was too dangerous to admit. So they turned her into a legend, a cautionary tale, a seductress. But if you listen closely, beneath the Roman slander, beyond the Hollywood glamour, you'll hear the voice of a queen who refused to be erased. And she's still speaking. Segment 2. The hidden power of Highland women in medieval Scotland. We've just left the golden barge of Cleopatra, floating down the Nile like a dream in purple silk. Now, Let's walk into the cold, into the Highlands of Scotland, 5th–10th century. Rain slashes sideways. The wind howls through glens like a grieving spirit. And in a stone tower clinging to a cliffside, a woman stands at the window, watching the horizon. Her husband is gone. Her sons are gone. Raiders are coming. And she's not waiting. She's commanding. Because while history remembers the Highland warrior, kilted, claymore in hand, face painted for war, it forgets the woman who held the clan together when the warriors fell. Tonight we meet the silent architects of survival, the Highland women who ruled not from thrones, but from hearths, from memory, from the quiet corners where empires are preserved, the real keepers of the clan. When you think of the Scottish Highlands, you probably picture men charging across the moors, swords raised, tartan flapping in the wind. But here's the truth. If the men were the muscle of the clan, the women were its spine. Because when the men rode off to war, sometimes for months, who kept the estate running? Who fed the people? Who defended the home? Not the sheep, not the bards. It was the women. They weren't just waiting for their men to return. They were running the entire operation, managing land, livestock, food stores, finances, and even diplomacy. Imagine waking before dawn in a stone keep, frost on the window, fire nearly out. You've got children to feed, tenants to oversee, and a border clan eyeing your cattle. Your husband? Off raiding someone in the next valley. No letters, no return date, just silence. And yet the butter is churned, the wool is spun. The walls are guarded. That wasn't luck, that was leadership. And it wasn't rare, it was expected. Matriarchs, the unseen queens. In the Highland world, power didn't always wear armor. Sometimes it wore a woolen shawl and spoke in Gaelic proverbs. The clan matriarch, often the chief's wife or mother, was more than a noblewoman. She was a strategist, a diplomat, and often the true center of power. Marriages weren't about love. They were alliances, and it was the matriarch who decided which family to bind with and which to keep at sword's length. She could see 6 generations ahead. Would this union bring peace? Or ignite a blood feud? And when decisions were made, her word carried weight, sometimes more than the chief's, because while men fought with steel, women fought with memory. They remembered who betrayed whom in 1423, who broke an oath, who still owed a debt in cattle, and if someone forgot, the matriarch would remind them quietly over a cup of ale, with a look that could freeze a man's blood. You didn't cross a Highland matriarch, not if you wanted to keep your land or your life. Defenders of the hearth. Now let's talk about war. When raiders came, and they always came, the men weren't always there to stop them. So who defended the tower? Who stood at the gate? Again, the women. And no, they weren't screaming in the corner. They were pouring boiling oatmeal over the walls, yes. Boiling oatmeal. One 16th century account tells of a Highland lady who fended off an entire raiding party by dumping scalding porridge on their heads from the battlements. Not glamorous, but devastatingly effective. Others took up swords. Some led servants and elderly men in a siege defense. One woman is said to have held a castle for 3 days until reinforcements arrived. And when the smoke cleared, no songs were sung, no medals awarded, just a quiet return to work, patching the roof, burying the dead, feeding the children. Because in the Highlands, survival wasn't heroic. It was routine, the keepers of memory. In a world without books, without schools, without maps, who kept the clan's soul alive? The women. They were the oral historians, the storytellers, the guardians of genealogy. From childhood, girls were taught the clan's legends, not as bedtime stories, but as living law. Who fought whom? Who betrayed the chief? Who died for the land? These weren't just tales. They were warnings. They were weapons. A single forgotten name could spark a feud. A misremembered oath could cost lives. And the women? They held all of it in their minds, in their songs, in their lullabies. Some became Sionad, the Gaelic bards, memorizing entire sagas, passing them down through generations. Even if they couldn't read, they carried more history in their heads than most lords had in their libraries. And when tragedy struck, they mourned aloud. The Caenig, the keening woman, would wail at funerals, her voice raw, guttural, shaking the glen. It wasn't just grief. It was protest. It was memory made sound. And in that cry, the clan remembered. We are not broken. We are not forgotten. Healers, midwives, and the first line of medicine. In the Highlands, there were no hospitals, no doctors, no pharmacies. So who delivered babies? Who stitched wounds? Who cured fevers? The wise woman, the healer, the one they might later call a witch. These women weren't just herbalists. They were botanists, psychologists, and surgeons, all rolled into one. They knew which plants could stop bleeding, which roots could ease childbirth, which mushrooms would kill you, and which might save you. The midwife was the most respected of all. She didn't just deliver babies. She delivered the future of the clan. And when a birth went wrong, she stayed. She cleaned the blood. She buried the child. She held the mother. No applause, no thanks, just duty. But their power came with danger. Too much knowledge, too much influence. That made you a target. Many healers were accused of witchcraft, especially if a chief's son died under their care. And yet, the clan still came to them. Because when your child was sick, you didn't care about superstition. You cared about survival. So yes, they were called witches, but history knows better. They were the first doctors of the Highlands. Widows, the women who stepped into power. When a husband died, in battle, in feud, in silence, the story didn't end. For Highland women, widowhood wasn't the end. It was a beginning. If there were no adult sons, the widow might take command. She became the de facto chief, steward of the land, guardian of the children, keeper of the legacy. And she didn't wait for permission. She acted. Some used their grief to fuel revenge. They'd rally the clan, finance a raid, keep a blood feud alive for generations. Others chose peace. They'd host both sides, offer truce through tears, remind men what war truly cost. A widow wasn't weak. She was dangerous, because she had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. And in a world where men died young, these women weren't just surviving, they were leading. Why don't we remember them? So why don't we know their names? Because history is written by the victors, and in the Highlands the victors were the men with swords. The bards sang of battles, not of bread baked during a siege. The chronicles recorded raids, not the women who rebuilt after them. Their strength wasn't loud. It didn't march into battle with a banner. It showed up in the quiet moments, a child fed, a border held, a story remembered, a clan kept alive. They didn't conquer, they endured. And in the end, that's what saved the Highlands. Music swells slightly, then softens. The tone becomes reflective. Today, when we think of Scotland, we remember the warriors, the kilts, the bagpipes, the blood. But if you walk through the ruins of a Highland tower or listen to an old Gaelic song passed down through generations, you'll hear something else. You'll hear the echo of a woman's voice. Low, steady, unbroken, speaking in proverbs, singing lullabies, pouring oatmeal on invaders. She wasn't in the chronicles, she wasn't on the battlefield, but she was everywhere. Because while men fought for the clan, she was the clan. And though her name may be lost, her legacy is not. Segment 3. Renaissance Italian Court Banquets as Political Theater. We've just left the Highlands, where women ruled through silence, snow, and boiling oatmeal. Now, let's trade the cold for something richer. Let's step into a candlelit hall in 15th century Florence. The air is thick with the scent of roasted pheasant, orange blossom, and cinnamon. Tapestries hang like silent judges. Gold-rimmed goblets wait, filled with sweet Sicilian wine, and at the center of it all, a table. But this is not dinner. This is warfare with a garnish. Because in the courts of Renaissance Italy, your plate said more about your power than any crown ever could. The banquet as a stage of power. Imagine walking into a palace where every detail, from the color of the napkins to the shape of the bread, has been orchestrated like a symphony. This wasn't just a meal, it was a performance, a declaration. A negotiation played out in courses, not in council chambers. The Medici of Florence, the Este Ferrara, the Sforza of Milan. These families didn't just rule with armies or laws. They ruled with banquets. To be invited to one was an honor, but also a test. Sit too far from the host? You were out of favor. Drink too much? You were unstable. Compliment the wrong dish? You might accidentally insult a rival duke. These weren't meals. They were diplomatic traps with gravy on top. And behind it all, every element, the seating, the silver, the music, was coded. A language of power written in saffron and symbolism. The menu as a message. Think the food was just about taste? Think again. In Renaissance Italy, every dish was a calculated move, an edible message designed to impress, intimidate, flatter, or destroy. Take a roasted swan, glazed in saffron and cloves. That wasn't just dinner, it was a status update. Saffron had to be imported from Persia. Cloves came from islands most people couldn't even point to on a map. And the swan? Only the wealthy could afford to keep lakes stocked with birds they'd never eat. That single plate screamed, I own land, I trade across continents, and I don't need to explain myself. Even the order of the courses was strategic. Meals began with delicate citrus salads, light, elegant, to balance the humors. Then came the power plays, roasted meats, spiced beyond reason, showing off access to the rarest flavors. Finally, the indulgence, sugared fruits, poached pears, cheese tarts, a display of excess so bold it bordered on arrogance. And the number of courses? Odd numbers were elegant, even numbers too plain. 13 courses, that wasn't excess, it was a flex. Because in this world, sweet and savory were mixed in the same bite, not for flavor, but to shock the palate, to prove that the host lived beyond common rules. A dish of roasted veal with cinnamon and sugar wasn't a mistake. It was a challenge. Can you handle complexity? Can you handle me, the chef, the unseen general of the kitchen? Now, let's talk about the man, or sometimes woman, behind the magic. This wasn't some peasant stirring a pot in the shadows. The court chef was a celebrity, a strategist, and in some cases a political weapon. Italian nobles fought fiercely to steal the best cooks from rival courts, from France, from Spain, from the Ottoman world. A single chef could elevate a family's prestige faster than a victory in battle. Training? Rigorous. Some came from apothecary backgrounds, trained not just in flavor, but in the four humors: hot, cold, wet, dry. Food wasn't just about taste. It was about health, balance, and control. And then there was logistics. No modern ovens. No refrigeration. Dishes had to travel from kitchen to hall, sometimes across courtyards, up staircases, without losing heat, texture, or drama. A miracle, a military operation. A chef wasn't just a cook. He was a general, a choreographer, a control freak. And he didn't work alone. He collaborated with sculptors, painters, even playwrights. Because in Renaissance Italy, food wasn't just eaten, it was unveiled. Sugar sculptures, edible propaganda. Now, picture this. At the height of the banquet, the music stops. Servants enter, carrying not a dish, but a castle. A castle made entirely of sugar. Drawbridges, towers, flags, even tiny soldiers marching across the ramparts. This wasn't dessert. It was propaganda you could eat. Sugar in the 15th century was more precious than gold. It had to be imported, refined, stored like treasure. To use it for art, that was the height of luxury. And these weren't just pretty displays. They told stories. A sugar lion defeating a unicorn, a political victory, a marzipan garden with two intertwined trees, a marriage alliance. Guests didn't just stare, they decoded. Because in this world, to be seen as ignorant was worse than being poor. And then came the moment. The host would invite guests to break the sculpture, to destroy a masterpiece, and then consume it. It was theatrical consumption. Performance art you could digest. Some sculptures were tinted with saffron, beetroot, even lapis lazuli. Others brushed with edible gold. A few were lightly smoked for dramatic effect. Because if you're going to waste a pound of sugar on a dragon eating a Turk, you might as well make it smell like fire and victory. The global plate. Power on a platter. In Renaissance Italy, the farther an ingredient had traveled, the more powerful the host appeared. Spices led the charge. Pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, each worth its weight in silver by the time it reached the table. And yet nobles used them lavishly, dusting them over lamb, stewing them into wine just to prove, I can afford to eat my fortune. But it wasn't just spices. Citrus from Sicily, dates from North Africa, rice paired with almond milk and rose water, a dish that made you feel like a sultan. Even ostrich eggs, ambergris, preserved lemons wrapped in silk, not because they tasted good, but because they were rare. Because in this world you didn't need to enjoy the flavor. You needed to witness it. And fish, an inland court serving fresh sea bream, that meant fast couriers, elaborate preservation, a kitchen staff on high alert. It was a message. If I can command the sea to my table, what else can I command? Food wasn't seasonal. It wasn't local. It was global. And if you couldn't afford it, you weren't worth feasting with. Diplomacy in every bite. The most important negotiations didn't happen in council rooms. They happened over a goblet of wine and a glazed partridge. Seating was calculated. Who sat near the host? Who was placed so far down the table they were practically in exile? Food choices sent messages too. Serving a regional delicacy? A nod of respect. Omitting one? A subtle snub. And the toasts? Those were verbal daggers wrapped in velvet. To the continued peace between our families sounds sweet. But if the guest had just betrayed a pact, it lands like a knife. Even the entertainment had purpose. Dancers reenacting myths that mirrored current politics. Poets reciting verses with double meanings. Musicians playing songs tied to rival courts, sometimes as mockery, sometimes as warning. It was a masterclass in controlled chaos. The host had to dazzle, flatter, and remind everyone who held power, all while chewing elegantly. And the guests? They came armed with charm, wit, and quiet challenges. One clever comment over dessert could earn an alliance. One spilled goblet could end a truce. So while armies clashed outside, the real power moves were made over roast quail and saffron rice. In Renaissance Italy, diplomacy wasn't a handshake. It was dinner. Women at the table. Grace's armor, now for the women. They weren't just ornaments. They were players, but the rules were sharper for them. Men could boast, drink heavily, tear into a leg of mutton with bravado. Women, they had to be restrained, elegant, precise. A noble woman who held her goblet just so, who used her knife with care, who ate stew without staining her gown. She wasn't just dining. She was demonstrating discipline, wealth, and refinement. Etiquette manuals had entire chapters on how women should sit, chew, even smile. One wrong move, social suicide. One well-timed compliment, a marriage proposal. But don't be fooled. These women used a table to network, eavesdrop, flirt, and assert soft power. A question: was this saffron imported from Naples? Could reveal trade secrets. A comment about a rival's dish could spread like wildfire. Some even helped design the banquet, choosing symbolic dishes, overseeing sugar sculptures that told stories of their lineage. And seating? A woman placed near the host was being honored or tested. Next to a foreign ambassador, she might be the unofficial diplomat of the night. In short, women at the table weren't just eating, they were performing. And in a world where silence was strategy, grace wasn't optional. It was armor. The banquet is total theater. If you thought this was just a meal, you were in for a shock. These weren't dinners. They were immersive spectacles. Trumpets announced guests. Poets delivered verses tailored to the host's glory. Jugglers, acrobats, and masked figures wove through the hall, whispering riddles, part entertainment, part espionage. Food didn't just arrive, it performed. A roast carried in on a gilded litter, flanked by children dressed as angels. A pie that burst open to release live birds. One banquet even featured a mock siege, where sugar cannons fired candy at a marzipan fortress. Tables were shaped like zodiac signs. Dishes color-coordinated to represent rival factions. Even the clearing of the table was choreographed, dancers sweeping away plates in perfect rhythm. Why go to such lengths? Because in Renaissance Italy, appearances were reality. A well-staged banquet could dazzle an ambassador, distract a rival, or seal a marriage without a single word spoken. Feasting was a performance, and if you wanted to survive at court, you'd better know your lines, the legacy of the feast. Centuries later, the sugar castles have crumbled. The lutes have fallen silent, but the legacy of these banquets lives on. Today, when world leaders dine over 7-course state dinners, when celebrities throw opulent weddings with leaked wine lists, when chefs are treated as artists, not servants, they're channeling a tradition born in Florentine palazzos and Venetian halls. The Renaissance courts gave us sequential courses, the focus on plating and presentation, the idea that dessert is a finale, not just more food, the chef as a creator, not a laborer. But more than that, they taught us that a meal is never just about food. It's about identity, power, story. The banquet wasn't just dinner. It was a narrative told through pheasant and pomegranate, sugar towers and salted fish. It turned the dining table into a stage, and every guest a willing actor in a production of luxury, control, and illusion. So the next time you sit down to a holiday meal or watch a royal wedding feast on TV, remember, you're not just seeing food, you're witnessing the ghost of a Renaissance banquet, where every bite was a move in the grand game of power. Music swells slightly, then softens into a reflective pause. Transition line to next segment. But not all monuments to power were built for celebration. Some were built in silence, in suffering, in blood. Next, we travel to ancient China, where one emperor decided to wall off the world, and in doing so buried thousands beneath the earth. Let's walk the Great Wall of China, not as tourists, but as witnesses. Segment 4. The Great Wall of China under Qin Shi Huang Wei. Ve just left the candlelit halls of Renaissance Italy, where power was served on silver platters, spiced with diplomacy and glazed with sugar. Now, let's walk into silence, to a place where the air is thin, the wind cuts like a blade, and stretching across mountain after mountain, like a scar stitched into the spine of the earth, stands a wall. Not the polished, postcard-perfect Great Wall you've seen in pictures. No, this is the original, the first, built not of stone but of tamped earth, blood, and command. This is the Great Wall under Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China, and this is not a story of defense. It's a story of control, the man who forged an empire and a wall. Before there was China as we know it, there was chaos. 7 warring states, clashing armies, different coins, different laws, different scripts, a land fractured, bleeding, burning. And then he came, Qin Shi Huang, born Ying Zheng, a king of a small, ruthless state in the West. He didn't just want power. He wanted perfection. By the age of 38, he had crushed every rival kingdom. In 221 BCE, he declared himself first emperor of China, the Shi Huangdi, and he didn't stop there. He standardized the writing system. He unified the currency. He built roads that stretched like veins across the empire. He demanded order in everything, language, law, measurement, even the width of card axles. Because to Qin Shi Huang, disorder was weakness, and weakness had to be erased. But there was one thing he couldn't control, one force that didn't bow to laws or roads or coins, the steppe, and the warriors who rode across it like thunder. The enemy, the Yonazinu, ghosts on horseback. To the north of his empire, beyond the farmlands and cities, lay the Eurasian steppe, vast, open, untamed. And from it came the Xiongnu, a confederation of nomadic horsemen who lived by speed, not stone. They didn't build cities, They didn't farm. They didn't obey emperors. They struck like lightning, raided villages, stole grain, cattle, people, then vanished into the horizon. To the Qin, who lived by seasons, by walls, by order, the Xiongnu were chaos incarnate. They couldn't be defeated in a single battle. They couldn't be reasoned with. They couldn't be controlled. So Qin Shi Huang asked a simple question. What if we build a line so long, so strong that it separates civilization from wilderness? Not just a wall, a statement. The first great wall, a spine for an empire. Before Qin, there were walls, scattered, fragments, left by earlier kingdoms, built to protect their own borders, but they were disjointed, useless against a fast-moving enemy. So Qin did the unthinkable. He ordered them connected, not just repaired, not just extended, but unified into one continuous barrier stretching from the Gobi Desert in the west to the Yellow Sea in the east. Over 3,000 miles of mountains, deserts, rivers, and cliffs. This wasn't just defense, it was symbolism, a physical manifestation of his empire, unified, unbroken, eternal. And it was built the same way he ruled, with absolute power and absolute cruelty. The cost, a wall built on bones. Let's be clear, the Great Wall was not built by proud volunteers. It was built by the broken, conscripted peasants torn from their fields, prisoners of war stripped of identity, criminals sentenced to service, a death sentence disguised as duty, entire families forced to march north with nothing but rags and fear. They didn't come willingly. They came in chains, and they didn't build a wall. They died building it. Historians estimate hundreds of thousands perished, some say over 400,000, from exhaustion, from disease, from starvation, from beatings, and when a worker died mid-task. There are accounts, some say legends, others say truth, that their bodies were buried inside the wall itself, not as honor, not as memorial, but as filler, as if a man's life could be measured in pounds of earth. They called it the longest cemetery on earth, and in the cold winds that howl across the northern passes, you can almost hear them, not screaming, just breathing, still here. How was it built? The brutal engineering. Forget cranes, forget trucks, forget blueprints. The Great Wall of Qin was built with wood, dirt, and muscle. The primary method? Rammed earth. Workers stacked wooden frames, filled them with layers of soil, gravel, and reeds, then pounded each layer with heavy poles over and over until it hardened like concrete. In the dry north, this earth could last for centuries, but the labor was relentless. Imagine dragging baskets of mud up steep mountain paths, working 12 hours a day, in freezing winters and scorching summers, with no shelter, no medicine, no hope. And yet they built, not just a wall, but a military network. Watchtowers spaced every few hundred meters, perched on ridges like vultures. Signal fires, 1 flame for sighting, 2 for attack, 3 for full invasion. Garrisons where soldiers waited, bored and cold, ready to respond. In ideal conditions, a warning could travel hundreds of miles in a single day, faster than any horse. This wasn't just a wall, it was a machine of control, a nervous system for an empire that refused to blink. The emperor's obsession? Control beyond death. Qin Shi Huang didn't just want to rule. He wanted to live forever. He sent alchemists across the land, searching for elixirs of immortality. He believed he would never die, but deep down he knew the truth. So he built two things: the Great Wall to protect his empire after he was gone, his tomb guarded by 8,000 terracotta soldiers, buried with treasures, traps, and rivers of mercury. He thought he could cheat death, but in the end, he didn't need to, because the wall was his immortality. It outlasted his dynasty. It outlasted his name. It outlasted the very idea of Qin. And when the Han dynasty rose, they didn't tear it down. They repaired it, extended it, used it, because even emperors who hated Qin Shi Huang still feared the steppe, and so the wall lived on. The legend of Meng Jiangnu, a woman's grief that shook the wall. But history isn't only written by emperors. Sometimes it's written in tears. There's a legend, one that has been told for over 2,000 years. A woman named Meng Jiangnu. She was newly married, happy, in love. Then the conscription came. Her husband was taken to build the Great Wall. Months passed, then years. No word, so she walked hundreds of miles through snow and sand, carrying winter clothes for the man she loved. When she reached the wall, she asked, "Where's my husband?" No one knew his name. No one cared. But she kept asking until someone whispered. He died. They buried him in the wall. She fell to her knees, and she wept, not softly, not quietly. She wept like the sky had cracked open, and legend says the wall trembled, then split, and from the rubble bones emerged. She knew them instantly. They were his. And then, in some versions, she cursed the emperor. In others, she walked into the sea and drowned. But her story didn't die. For centuries, people left offerings at temples in her name, not to honor the wall, but to mourn the nameless, the ones who built it, the ones who were forgotten, because Meng Jiangnu wasn't just a woman. She was all of them, the voice of the voiceless, the soul of the silenced. And her tears, they were stronger than any stone, the wall that never stopped building. Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BCE. His empire collapsed just 4 years later, but the wall, it remained. Later dynasties, Han, Northern, Wei, Sui, repaired it, extended it, used it, and then came the Ming dynasty to 1,500 years later. They rebuilt it in stone and brick, with battlements, with fortresses, with the iconic look we know today. But even their wall followed Qin's original path, because the idea, the vision, was already there. And so the Great Wall became a living artifact, a monument that evolved but never forgot its origin. The legacy, a monument of contradictions. Today, the Great Wall is a symbol of Chinese pride, of engineering genius, of endurance. But it's also a symbol of tyranny, of suffering, of the cost of power. It protected, but it also imprisoned. It unified, but it also oppressed. It stood for order, but it was built on chaos. And Qin Shi Huang, he never found immortality in elixirs, but he found it here in the shape of the land. He changed the geography of a nation, not with war, not with law, but with a line drawn across the earth. And that line still speaks, not in words, but in silence, in wind, in memory. Music swells, soft, mournful, then fades into stillness. So the next time you see the Great Wall, don't just see stone. See earth, see bone, see a woman weeping. See an emperor who thought he could outlast time. Because the Great Wall isn't just a wall, it's a story. One written in ambition, suffering, and the quiet hope that someone someday will remember the ones who built it. And so our journey ends, not with a sword or a crown or a feast, but with a wall, and the understanding that history isn't just made by the powerful. It's made by the seen and the unseen, the remembered and the forgotten, the queens, the women, the cooks, the laborers, all of them holding up the world, one silent act at a time. Thank you for walking with me through these stories. If this resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from? What part of this journey hit you the hardest? And if you're new here and you enjoy deep human stories from history, like, subscribe, but only if it feels right. This isn't about numbers. It's about connection. Until next time, stay curious, stay kind, and remember, the past isn't dead. It's just waiting to be heard.